Hello, friends. Thanks for making time for us again. This week, our guest is Frank Mullane. Frank is one of those people that make you take a step back and feel incredibly grateful that somehow your paths have crossed. He's a man who's pushing forward, still feeling it all after a life that many of us probably couldn't even comprehend. Frank lost his brother to suicide, and his sister and nephew were murdered in a fatal act of domestic abuse within a couple of years of each other. And since then, Frank has put the powerful energy that he says emerges as a result of injustice towards founding the advocacy and peer support group AAFDA, or Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse. This organisation has helped hundreds of families as they come to terms with fatal domestic abuse. This is an incredibly honest and raw conversation with a special human. Frank was awarded an MBA in 2019 for his exceptional work around domestic abuse advocacy and community building, and we hope this spreads awareness of domestic violence and reminds us just how much the human spirit can withstand with the help of a strong support system. I've linked the AAFDA website in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Listen, Seb and myself have been amazed by the work that you're doing, by some of the things that have happened to you in your life. And we said just before air that it's almost a miracle that you're here doing what you're doing to this day. So we're very grateful. We're very grateful to Fiona for making this happen, also for being the interlink here. But yeah, no, we want to thank you. We really are grateful and so happy that you agreed to come on.
Fiona really inspired me. She spoke at one of our early conferences, and her story was truly amazing.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. Honestly, sometimes, very often, even words don't do people or scenarios justice, and you could say every word under the sun about Fiona, but you can't get it. You can't pinpoint it because what she did, and the courage, the belief, the faith, all of that is just unbelievable. It's immeasurable. Listen, Frank, there's a chance people are listening and they haven't listened to the Fiona podcast, and if that's the case, could you tell us a bit about yourself? Could you tell the listeners a bit about yourself and how you ended up doing what you're doing now?
Sure. I am Frank Mullane, as they say in Ireland, as you say. I'm the chief executive and founder of AAFDA, which stands for Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse. And I set it up 5 years after my sister and nephew were murdered in domestic abuse. And I set that up to help other families that would be in my position.
And sorry, Jim. And when someone says, and this is coming from a really just ignorant standpoint, but I just want to make sure we dot all the I's and cross all the T's. But when you say fatal domestic abuse, does that mean that someone has lost their lives at the hands of someone who they lived with, or at the hands of someone who they knew? Is that what classes it as fatal domestic abuse, as opposed to maybe, I don't know, being murdered by a stranger, for example?
Yes. Domestic homicide or fatal. Sorry, if I can just explain it was an accident. When I called it Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, I didn't realise actually that had much more meaning than I realised at the time in 2008 when I started it, because there are many people that lose their life by taking their own life when they are in positions of domestic abuse. It doesn't always mean that the domestic abuse was the single factor that caused it, but in some cases it may be. And in fact, there is one man who's been convicted of manslaughter following the suicide of his ex-partner. He was nowhere near the scene, but the judge said it was your abuse that caused it.
Right.
So fatal domestic abuse could be any death in some way that could be traced back to domestic abuse. And it doesn't have to be intimate partner, it could be interfamilial. There are, sadly it seems to be mostly, there are sons who kill their mothers, for example.
Thanks for clearing that up, Frank.
one thing that came up when me and Seb were having a chat about this conversation yesterday was the decision on your end that you wanted to, and tell me if I'm wrong, dedicate your life to this field. It must have been so challenging, and I want you to talk, if you're okay with that, talk about your sister Julia and your nephew William. But I just wanted to first ask how do you find that working in this area on a daily basis for advocacy in this department is some sort of catharsis for what happened to your sister and to your nephew? Because Seb and myself said yesterday, like, wow, so many people would have had this happen to them, and then they couldn't go near the idea of interacting with this again. Like they wouldn't be able to watch TV shows where there's murder. They wouldn't be able to, they would avoid it at all costs almost, because particularly when it was someone so close to you. I guess I would like to know your relationship with the work that you're doing now, and whether it's been, I imagine it's so challenging, but I imagine, tell me if I'm wrong, if there's some sort of, maybe not even peace, but some sort of, this is what I should be doing. This feels right.
Yeah, and when you say dedicated, that's not how I see it. What I had no choice in a way, in the sense that the work I was doing, it just felt meaningless. And I was starting to make connections with people in the domestic abuse sector. I was beginning to read about it, something that I didn't do before the murders. And, I felt that I had to be involved. There was a bit of feeling of compulsion. It felt meaningful to wake up every day and be doing something so serious, and to try to do it as well as I could. And it brought me in touch with lots of really inspiring people. I just did not have my heart in the work that I was doing before, which just had no more meaning for me, I'm afraid. And I meet lots of family members who changed their employment after murders.
Yeah, it's something that Jim and I. Sorry, Jim. Sorry, it's something that Jim and I have we've struggled with, and we recently did a podcast with Adam Starr about the meaning of life, and yeah, I think a lot of us struggle with it. But of course, when you have something so stark, so I don't know how you put it into words, that happened to you, where you really are seeing the value of life and how perishable it can be. I can only imagine how that will kind of steer you into a place where you feel like whatever I was doing beforehand is, like you said, completely meaningless, and I can't waste any more time, just doing a normal 9 to 5 to pay the bills. And so I really commend you for taking that step, because a lot of us, including myself at the moment, to be honest, feel like we are probably just doing the 9 to 5s to pay the bills, and we're maybe trying to find those vocations and those ways to make our lives, and like you said, every day feel like you're doing something meaningful and something that actually changes the world for a better place. But yeah, like Jim said, I just couldn't. I was just running over and over and over in my head yesterday, and I just thought, I don't know how someone who has had 2 family members, let alone 2, be murdered, and then put themselves in a scenario whereby they're going to have constant triggers, and everything. I can imagine that everything in some way, shape or form reminds you of, what happened. And that's not to say that you would have forgot had you gone and flew off into the jungle and no one had ever seen Frank Mullane again. But, there's ways that we try to protect ourselves as humans. And I wanted to ask, how did you, we've all experienced loss at some point in our lives. It's just it's a nature of life. But there's ways, a lot of us, we can kind of chalk it up to, it's bad luck. If you lose someone through cancer, for example. It's terrible, don't get me wrong, but unfortunately the statistics are that I think 1 in 2 of us will have cancer in our lifetimes, or if you have a car crash, it's a terrible accident, but you can maybe in your own mind, to try and find some level of peace, you can say, oh, it was an awful accident, it's terrible, but that's life at the end of the day. But when murder comes along, that feels so unjust, such an awful way to lose a person, and I can't imagine how you come to peace, if at all. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about that. How have you managed to get yourself in a mental state where you can actually face these troubles and be an advocate for others, and not feel like you're in this massive torment still?
There's a great energy caused by the feeling of injustice, as you say, and I put that into it. And, I still have that because I read about other injustices and I meet other families and I can help them. I mean, I feel that my biggest responsibility is to help families rejoin life. I'd never call it normal life. I'd just call it the life after what's happened. But it's important to help families know that it can still be a good life. I mean, my family still has a good life, and we can have a happy life. Sometimes people can get a bit stuck trying to get information out of police or other authorities. Maybe they never get the information and they're speculating forever. Our job is to try and help them get that information, or if we can't get it, to help them understand that it's something they might have to work around and live with, but in some way to sort of grab what remains of life and have a good life. It seems really important to do that. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, forgive me, but...
No, of course. One thing, you talk about the injustice of it all, and I think a lot of people listening will, obviously they'll understand the injustice of losing someone to murder, but the other part of it that you're talking about is also the injustice that you kind of felt that came from the police. And this is not to... I don't want to make this a podcast where we bash the police or anything by it, and I know that's not your stance at all. But for people who maybe aren't quite aware of maybe your particular situation, or maybe aren't aware of how they think, oh well, the only injustice in a murder is the fact that someone was murdered, and they kind of feel like that's what the be all and end all of injustice. Could you kind of explain to us and shed some light on how, in your case and maybe in other cases, how maybe willingly or unwillingly the police can also add to that sense of injustice?
Well, first of all, to start with a finding by Louise Casey, who was the first ever Victims Commissioner, and she found in a study of about 400 families that the journey through the criminal justice system was as traumatic as the bereavement itself. And I've always found that a really startling finding, that it was as traumatic as the bereavement itself. So, nobody set up the criminal justice system in order to traumatize families, but it does traumatize families. And, there are certain inequities, so it's very difficult to get legal aid for families at inquests, for example. It's very difficult. The inquest can be the place where families can expect to get information and expect to, be able to close that one objective that they have, which keeps them on a kind of a hamster wheel of looking for more and more information. The inquest can help them get off that wheel by providing information, by revealing information to them. But sometimes you need a skilled lawyer to be able to achieve that for you. And all of the agencies that come to the inquest, the police, probation, social services, etc., they all have lawyers paid for out of the public purse, but usually the family does not. So there are many difficulties for families afterwards. It's a new language. They're thrust into a system with a new language. They don't know their rights and opportunities. They've got lots of people coming to see them. Even control is taken from them. So murder is the business of the state. The state is offended by murder as well, and it takes charge. So if you think about it, in the criminal trial, there's a barrister for the state and there's a barrister for the defence, but there isn't one for the victim. or the victim's family. There's one for the Crown, as they might say, and there's one for the defence. It's not about the victim's story or the family's position. It's just about establishing guilt or otherwise in the criminal trial.
Thanks for clarifying that, Frank. Before we move on, I would love to hear a bit about your sister and your nephew and what kind of people they were and how they lived their life,
Thanks for asking that. My sister Julie was a health visitor, and she was very supportive of me. A difficult time in my life, she was extremely supportive of me, very, very loving, and hugely loving and good fun as well. She had a great sense of humour, and as they say, where my parents came from an island, a good bit of devilment, mischief. And Will, my nephew, a beautiful lad. We had a really good, fun relationship. He was a musician or a budding musician. We would try and write songs and have great fun with crazy songs and mad humour and I just had some beautiful times in their company.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Frank. I guess what I'd like to ask you about is after the murders, what was, I guess, what was the thing that kept you going? How did you initially come to set up the organization? Did you have a support system? I'd love to know, because as me and Sarah were saying, we all have a lot of challenges in our life, but this is something huge that a lot of people maybe can't survive. It is just so traumatic, so heavy, and I guess I'm sure the listeners would love to know what helped you during this unbelievable, arduous process.
Many things. First of all, we were concerned that we had been telling the police about the danger to my sister. We didn't understand the danger to Will, my nephew, and the police hadn't responded well at all, can I put it that way. And also on the night they had not responded, the night of the murders they had not responded well. So I was fueled by a sense of injustice. We raised debates in Parliament about it. We got our MP involved. We got a good lobby of people to try and bring pressure on the authorities to reveal what they'd been doing with the intelligence we'd been giving them about the abuse, for example. So the sense of injustice was one of the main drivers for fueling me, if you like, and what enabled me to keep going. But also my family and friends. I have a loving, very close family, and I don't think I could have done it without my family, quite frankly, and friends. And we all played different roles. And I remember one of my sisters saying to me, "Look, Frank, I don't do anything on this campaign." I said, "Yes, you do, because every time I come visit you, you give me some of the best food I've ever had. And then I'm fired up for a few more days, So everybody plays different roles. And then one of my brother-in-law played a kind of a research role, and another sister was looking at, domestic abuse history. And then some friends would do some work, and we had a team. Started to build a team, really. It was a team effort.
Do you think that it brought the family closer?
Yeah, we were pretty close and tactile. We were huggers, but I think it did bring us closer. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I wanted to. Are there ever days where, I don't know how to put this, but not that it feels like the wrong thing, but are there ever days where you feel like maybe I've gone as far as I can go down here. I don't know if I have any more strength or any more will to go on. I think I've maybe taken this as far as I can go. Or do you still feel energized, and do you never feel that feeling?
I haven't really felt it yet. I mean, I'm a bit older now and less energy physically wise maybe than I did when I started. But but mentally, I feel just as passionate. The people I meet in the sector inspire me. The families I meet. I mean, I meet families sometimes within weeks of these horrors happening, or we've now got a big advocate team. I meet less of those families, but they're the ones that keep me inspired and keep me strong. And also the rate of fatal domestic abuse, so suicides and homicides and other types of deaths, is so high that, my family always said at the beginning that we don't feel we can walk away while we're witnessing something that's broken, a broken system. And we need to come up with something better and more powerful, because if you think of the sort of resources and governmental responses to things like terrorism, we're not seeing that for domestic abuse at the same level. There's no COBRA meeting for a domestic homicide, even when it's what's called a familicide, when the whole family's wiped out. But had that been a so-called terrorist attack, there might have been a COBRA meeting in government. We don't see that for domestic homicides. And I think we need to raise the status of the crime of domestic abuse. It's so offensive if you think about it. The person who professes to love you is actually your terrorizer, your tormentor, your controller. And it's hard for people to leave those individuals safely. Very, very, very difficult on many occasions.
I'm really glad that you touched on that, Frank, because that was going to be my second question. I don't know if this is, I mean, Jim and I are too young to say back in the good old days, but I don't know if this is something that's new, or maybe this is just human nature and it's always been this way, but now with more media it's become more obvious. But we always seem to, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's fatal domestic abuse, we kind of, very often you see in the media, there's essences of something the victim has a role to play here, and whilst they're the victim, they share the guilt in some shape or form. You see it with people, ladies who've been raped, and it's like, well, what clothes were you wearing? And that question should never be asked, for example. And I mean, Fiona did a really great job of explaining, but for people who maybe haven't listened to Fiona's episode, you said that you were giving intelligence, for example, to the police about your sister's situation before, obviously, it ended in murder. So for some people who may be listening to this and thinking, well, if Frank knew, and I assume then the family probably knew that she was being abused in some way, shape or form, how come she didn't manage to get out? How come she didn't manage to escape? How come she didn't manage to leave her tormentor? I'm not going to say it's her fault, but and they start asking questions about her. Can you explain to some of these people who maybe have these questions in their head how difficult it is, and why, for example, you don't get out until, unfortunately, sometimes it is too late?
It can be incredibly dangerous to leave an abusive relationship. There are some studies that say many people are killed within 6 weeks of leaving a dangerous relationship. Now, clearly, people do leave dangerous relationships and remain safe, but it can be extremely dangerous. Where do they go? Sometimes they've been denied access to accumulating funds, or an education, or an ability to have a job. If they're being coercively controlled, they might have been systematically denied that capability. They may not even speak the local language. They may have been denied access to learning that language. They've effectively been disenfranchised, if you like. The perpetrator may find them. They may have children going to school. It will be easy to find that person. Many women say that they feel safer by being closer to their tormentor. So, I mean, it's incredibly difficult to leave abusive relationships. It's simply not that easy.
Frank, you mentioned the fact that we don't really have a system to help victims of domestic abuse and fatal domestic abuse. Can I ask, since you started the organisation Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, do you see progress? Do you see, are we going in the right direction? I believe you started this in 2008.
Yes. Yeah.
So 13 years. Where are we?
Yeah, we do. We do have a system, but what I'm saying is, I think step change can be made in this rather than incremental change. but it requires will. It requires political will to say we need to really shove this along and raise its status. So we have, for example, something that happened after my sister's murders with the introduction of what are called independent domestic violence advocates, who essentially keep people alive and keep people from being repeatedly abused. It's a great role. We have multi-agency risk assessment conferences looking at high-risk cases. There are all sorts of tools and initiatives going on, but it's still not enough because the rate of domestic homicide is a stubbornly recurring figure. The rate of suicide from domestic abuse, from all available evidence, is a pretty strong indication that it's a higher number than the amount of homicides every week, higher than homicide. And then there's other deaths, unexplained deaths, double drug deaths, deaths from being outside and exposed to hypothermia, what have you, having left out of relationships and died in some other ways. So I don't know if we fully grasped the prevalence and the way that domestic abuse is permeating the whole of society. Now, I remember when I first joined this sector, and I was just beginning to learn after the murders, and I think I read a statistic that 1 in 4 women would experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. And I remember I'd be driving down the street saying, no, no, yes, no, 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 yes, no, 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 yes, in my mind thinking every 4th house. So I don't know if society's willing enough to look at this. There's kind of myths around this. So, there's work done. I've written a book with Professor Jane Monckton-Smith, in which we concluded that a woman killed, a married woman or a cohabiting woman killed by a partner, has a very low status in terms of homicide. And there's been other studies done on this. The status of women killed in domestic abuse is not high. It does not attract headline news. It does not attract necessarily the sympathy of the society. You'll hear people in the local shop saying things like, oh, what happened there? They were such a lovely couple. He was an absolute pillar of the community. She must have said something. Wow, oh, it's so sad. They got on so well. Not realising that there may have been years of horrific abuse, coercive control, which she had to keep hidden. My sister had to keep that abuse hidden. So I don't think society knows the full horror of what's going on. And we also, and this is a more sensitive topic, but I think that we keep from society sometimes the depth, the extent of depravity around these murders, the horrors, the overkill, the brutality and the hatred associated with multiple stabbings and scores and scores and scores of stabbings, even though the body is dead.
Yeah, it makes the hairs stand up on the back of your neck when you talk about that, and really does. In this time that we are right now in the UK, it's, women are feeling very vulnerable, with the Sarah Everard case, and, at the moment there's plans about some sort of app that Priti Patel wants to put into use, but I've heard a lot of women with very, convincing arguments saying basically why it'd be useless, why they wouldn't want to use an app, and so on and so forth. And here we are, three men on this on this chat right now, and this is not to say that men don't suffer from domestic abuse, and I do want to get into that with you as well. Mm-hmm. But whilst we're on the topic of women as the victims, what is it that we can look out for amongst our own friendship groups, because I'm very strong on the fact of that we should be policing ourselves. I come from it from a sexual abuse point of view, where that's kind of the hill that I'm willing to die on. That we can police our own friends to stop it getting to a point where a woman is sexually abused. But what can we do? I'll admit that I'm fairly ignorant when it comes to domestic abuse, and I maybe wouldn't know what the subtle tell signs are and to look out for amongst my friends. What is it that someone who's listening to this, what is it that we could maybe do more as men to help women feel safer in this society?
Well, we can stand up to other men. that are being horrific about women, and that goes on constantly. But we can also listen to women and make ourselves available to listen to women and listen properly, and that means with mouth closed and two ears open. And you know, sometimes it's the subtle behaviours of somebody. They might send signals, or they seem to be unable to come to many events, or they have to leave early, or they say, you know, he said I need to be back by a certain time, or her phone is being monitored. So I think it's really opening our minds. And actually, I would say to men, do what I didn't do before my sister and nephew were murdered. Google domestic abuse and get yourself educated on it. You know, there's tons of stuff out there that enables you to look out for stuff. So I'm just joining a project now in Wearside, in the north of England, where we're doing work to educate families and the public to help them help their siblings or daughters, etc., that are suffering domestic abuse. And you know, I'm so chuffed to be in this project, because that's exactly what I've wanted to do: help other brothers, sisters, etc., who suddenly find one of their families suffering abuse. How do I help them? What to say? And many years ago, there was a leaflet I found. It was produced by, I think it was the Greater London Domestic Violence Project. And I always remember a line that came out of the leaflet, and it said something like, if somebody approaches you about domestic abuse, or you suspect it, hang on and stay there for them. You might be the only person they told before they get killed, if they get killed. That line has always stayed with me. So, you know, if you ever think somebody's dropping a hint to you, or you suspect it, make yourself available to that person. You know, be entrepreneurial about it. You might have to make a safe space if somebody suspects, you know, that she's having an affair if she meets you or whatever. So you might need to be creative and think about that.
Yeah, Frank, you mentioned the importance of deep listening, and so often I kind of get frustrated at myself and just the fact that we're living in a world where we have the belief that we don't have time to be deep listening. You know, we need to do that. We need to do that. I can't really be here for that long. Sorry, or I want to bring this up, and I'm glad you brought that up. To the information that you can gain when you have let go of the possibility of responding immediately. Like you said, you close that mouth. The information that you can gain is so much more than words. You start to see their body language. You start to feel the tone in their voice, and you start to understand and see the nuances between whether this thing is particularly important that the person is saying, or maybe it's a bit more trivial. You know, maybe it's just a bit more about daily stresses. It's not about an overarching, like you say, terror. And yeah, I guess like I'm trying so hard, but I know to really listen to people, to really be there for people.
Well, no, just look, I'm a hypocrite. I'd love to be a great listener, but like most of us, I start off trying to listen and often not am a good listener. So I'm not trying to claim any great credit to being a good listener, but I'm just saying, you know, we've all got to try and do that.
I think it's Jim. I think, you know, Jim's actually one of my kind of inspirations when it comes to trying to be a good listener. But I think in general, I don't want to generalize too much, but in general, I think men find it harder to listen, because I think when we hear a problem, or we hear someone is, you know, telling us about something, an issue, whether that is literally that they're something on their seat doesn't work, or something much deeper. As men, we always see it as something to fix, and we try to come up with solutions. Or at least in my case, it's like, oh, okay, I understand, you told me this problem, and now let me give you a solution, or let me give you some advice, or let's see how we can try to work this out. And often I found, you know, like Jim says, if you actually just resist that urge and you just keep your mouth shut for maybe even 2 minutes longer than you would have liked to, you often find that they just want to they just want to let it out. And sometimes just by doing that, you've actually helped them. By not saying anything at all, they go, "Oh, thank you for that chat. That's really helped me." You know, and I think that's something that maybe men in general find a bit harder than, I mean, I know just in experience when I talk to my female friends, they're much better listeners than a lot of my male friends. And I know that's not because my male friends don't want to help. If anything, it's sometimes the opposite. They almost want to help too much, and they can't resist the urge to give advice or to try and find solutions.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. And sometimes sometimes I can listen to people's literal words too much, and what they're actually saying is something behind those words that I don't always. I'm trying to train myself to be better at that, but I don't always make the connection. Sometimes I just hear the actual words, but they're not it's not those words that they're saying. Do you follow me?
Absolutely, I know what you mean, Frank. But that's how we're trained. You know, we are products of our environment, we're products of our society, and whether it's that we're very busy and we have this huge schedule and that we don't have time to be reading in between the lines, or we feel like we don't have time to be reading in between the lines, it is something I think that we could all dedicate a bit more time to. And just on that, I mean, I think we covered the fact that perhaps all of us can do a bit more in terms of helping the ridiculously high rates of domestic abuse, and perhaps also like you said, not perhaps like you said, there are judicial flaws that are not helping the families, that are not helping people who are being subjected to this abuse. I also wanted to ask you, because I've seen, and I think it's very special and powerful coming from someone with your experience, the fact that you are also acknowledging the role of trauma within domestic abuse. You know, how can we expect domestic abuse to dramatically decrease if perhaps we're not getting at the very, very core? And I mean, I'm not a trauma expert. I like to do a bit of reading around trauma, but you can't help but think that the majority of people who are killing and murdering and harming the people that they apparently love are somewhat traumatized. And I think it was great to see that you acknowledged that.
Well, I'm not an expert in trauma either, and I'm really just beginning my journey to try and understand it, including my own trauma. But I came across a quote by a criminologist called James Galvarino, and it was told to me by Professor Neil Webster, who's the world guru on domestic homicide reviews. And the quote went something like, most killers are traumatized children occupying the minds, bodies and hearts of adult men. Now, I don't know if that's true, but this guy is a criminologist who's interviewed hundreds of killers. We ought to listen and think about this. And whilst it does not in any way excuse the behaviours of anyone to be abusive, there's absolutely not. But we do have to think, you know, if that statement is true, it means continually the world is producing more and more traumatized children occupying the minds, bodies and hearts of adult men, and it will keep coming, won't it? So there, you know, if we accept at that point how it is valid, then we ought to be addressing trauma in some way.
It just came to me that we spoke briefly about restorative justice before the recording of the podcast, and listeners will know that we had a phenomenal conversation with Dr. Marie Keenan last year. I'd love to know how you feel about the murder of your sister and nephew now, and your take on restorative justice and whether it's been helpful for you or the people that you've met on the journey.
I think restorative justice can be problematic in domestic abuse, but I don't think that anyone can dictate to anybody else a way forward in life for them that works. So one of our advocates, who's now retired, is still seeking to enter restorative justice with the man who killed her brother, because she remembers him when he was, you know, behaving normally, was a good man. She wants to understand what changed him. I don't know if that will help her, but my job is not to judge. My job is to help people and get them the best advice that they can to make sure they're taking the right steps that won't harm them and that will help them. I'm not an expert in that, so we would find somebody in restorative justice that, if somebody wanted to do that, to enable that person to go down that path if they wanted, but with the right advice and help.
For sure. And I think it's really important, Frank, that someone like yourself in your position with your, personal experience has the humanity to look into that and to try to explore that more, because, we did a podcast with Dr. James Cantor where we were talking about paedophilia, and they're often considered the complete scum of the earth and the absolute lowest of the low. I mean, even in prisons, murderers would like to see themselves as above a paedophile, and you'd have a lot of the public would agree with that image. What Dr. James Cantor said to me is that he said, it takes people who have suffered at the hands of paedophilia to almost use that jail-free card to say, I want to look into them as humans and to try and stop it at source, because they're the only people who kind of can, right? The people who've really suffered at the hands of. And, you are one of those, unfortunately, you're in that demographic where you can say, you're not hypothesizing about feelings or anything. You felt this firsthand, and for you to have the strength of character to look into the humanity of these people rather than to just kind of cast them aside as monsters who should just spend eternity in prison and that's that, and never considered anything more than that. That's where we find, I think, that's where real change can come from, and change in public discourse, political discourse, and ultimately, hopefully, help decrease the numbers in domestic abuse and fatal domestic abuse. Because if you can stop it at source, that's, they always say prevention is better than cure, and I truly believe that. I wanted to ask you, we spoke before about victims, and we've throughout this podcast, we've basically portrayed women as the victims and men as the sole perpetrators. But you, I'm sure more than anybody, will know that can be flipped straight on its head, and you could have maybe a female as the perpetrator, and actually you can have the male as a victim. And it's hard enough to get a young woman or a woman in general to come out and to offer and to seek help when they're being domestically abused. But the one maybe stigma that they don't have to deal with is that no one would think, or no one in their right mind, I should say, would think less of a woman being domestically abused by a man. But yet there is a very obvious stigma about a man who is suffering domestic abuse. And I can only imagine that if you are a man who's potentially listening to this, who's suffering from domestic abuse, or if you know anyone, it must be so much harder to come out and to say that you're being domestically abused, because the kind of automatic response will be, how are you going to be domestically abused by your girlfriend? Man up. What's she doing? Come on, get a grip type deal. All of that vernacular. How, in your experience, coming across cases, and I'm sure you've come across cases where men have been the victims, what can you just speak to us about that and maybe shed a light and kind of, I don't know, just talk to us about how that whole situation entails.
Well, first of all, let's be absolutely clear that the statistics for domestic homicide are very starkly that men tend to kill women. There are some men killed by women, but it's significantly, very largely, much less than the amount of women killed by men. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make is that the serious domestic abuse is more perpetrated by men on women than statistically by women on men. There are still men horrifically abused, and there are still men killed. The numbers are much less. But yes, there is a stigma for men there, but also remember that domestic abuse isn't just about physical domestic abuse. It can be all sorts of psychological types of interventions, deliberately undermining, gaslighting, reducing the self-esteem of, diminishing them in front of friends and family, denying them access to, ways of enlarging their life, if you like.
The families of the perpetrators will be left reeling as well, because they will, in most cases, I would expect that they would never expect their son to be capable of doing such a thing, and to find out that that's their son, that's who they've cared for, that's who they've brought up. They might even feel a sense of responsibility, and coming to terms with that the reality of who your son is, as opposed to who you thought they might be, is devastating. I know in my own family, the family member who was a paedophile came out. Eventually, we found out that he is a paedophile. It shocked the whole family, because you just thought, how can this man, the one that we all knew and loved, the favorite uncle, how is he the paedophile? What? I mean, and some people even rejected it. The shock was too much. So, again, I commend you for, again, the humanity of taking them into account and trying to help them heal, and not just focusing solely on the victims. Because I think whenever problems like this come across, we only think about the victims and the victim's family, maybe, and we kind of maybe almost put some guilt onto the perpetrators' families and loved ones. Of course, in most cases, they have no guilt at all. And so, again, I really thank you for bringing up that point, because it's a very important point and distinction to make, and something that maybe we should take into consideration if we knew anyone in this case, to maybe reach out to that perpetrator's family and see how they're dealing with it as well. For people maybe are not familiar, your brother committed suicide. Now, do you think, I don't know, how does he committed suicide? And you said before this podcast that it was due to the stigma of, was it depression that he was dealing with? Yeah. How you said that you wanted to come on here and help, but if you help one person by having this conversation, maybe reduce the stigma, then that would be worthwhile for you. I'm sure many people are plunged into depression after you have something, not even fatal domestic abuse, but just domestic abuse in general, are plunged into depression. That as well comes with its own stigma. Could you talk to us about your brother? Could you talk to us about the situation that led to him taking his life, and if there is, why do you think why was the stigma so bad that he felt like there was no escape for him?
Stupid. I was drinking a lot. I didn't know how to help him, but he was suffering from clinical depression, and he emigrated to Ireland about 6 months before he died. And we were in telephone contact, and I went over to visit him, and 7 days before he did it, I remember our last conversation. I always remember Bill saying, Frank, the stigma of saying, having a mental health concern is what really was cutting into him and hurting him. And I've always remembered that. Such a powerful line. And, I often think today when you approached me and I thought about this, I thought, wow, if Bill was alive today, that stigma wouldn't be there and he could work through it. And there's all these people that perhaps are not seeking help because they fear the stigma, come forward and seek help. I have mental health concerns. I suffer from anxiety. I have some OCD. I gave up drinking and joined a 12-step program. So, I know about addiction. If that's not a mental health problem, what is? So, I am there as well. But, I try to get help. I have clinical supervision. I have a loving family. I have good friends special friends that know about trauma and mental health difficulties and have shared with me ways forward and pointed me in the direction of sources of help, etc. So it seems much more open today that people can talk about mental health. And I mean, the challenges of COVID as well on top, and other challenges have really challenged my mental health. I'm still standing, but I've undoubtedly been affected by it, and I'm sure it's affected my behaviours and my productivity or what have you, and my well-being sometimes, because well-being doesn't last forever. I cry. I have really low days. I have really down times when I just have to be alone and It's not till I'm climbing back up that I can seek company. And I always remember one of the kindest things that happened to me recently, and it's just a tiny thing. But I think if we can do this for other people, then I think we're opening the way for people to be authentic about how they're feeling. So I was meeting a female friend for dinner, and I texted her in the day that, I was a bit down from some difficulties, but I would really try and cheer up for when we met. And I got the most amazing text back, which made me cry when I first got it. And it said, "No, be yourself. Come with how you're feeling. That's what friendship is." And I thought, wow, what an act of kindness. Opening the door for me to be authentic and to say exactly how I'm feeling. I didn't have to achieve some kind of false cheerfulness. I could just be who I was. What an amazing act. It sounds small, but with a powerful resonance. And it made me think, I've got to do that for someone else now. If we could all do that, would we be giving permission for people? Because the general narrative is, that's that thing that you see on Google, laugh, they laugh with you, cry and you cry alone. That's the kind of narrative that's given to people. You have to be happy, you have to be good company for people to want to be around you. Well, of course it's good to be good company, but it doesn't reflect the reality of life. Sadness doesn't last forever, thankfully, and well-being doesn't last forever. They move in cycles or randomly or whatever, but they change. So isn't it better that we just face that reality and allow people to be themselves? So, that had a big effect on me, and makes me want to do that for others, And look, I'm not trying to make out I'm going to be a great man because I'm going to do that for others. I've got a rubbish memory, so I'm going to have to be reminded of it. But I hope I am reminded of it, because it's important to do that for people.
Frank, I love hearing you speak. I love the emotion you bring. I love the fact that you are so open with the fact that you're just a flawed human trying to do good for other people, trying to do good for yourself. And some days I'm going to be sad and some days I'm not going to be sad. And I think that's us. That's all of us. We're all flawed. We're all, sometimes some of us are better actors than others, but we're all flawed. And the closer we can get to accepting that we are all flawed, the less likely we are to judge other people and the less likely we are to judge ourselves. I thought it would be interesting to note for listeners that I think this is the 79th episode. Frank is the first guest to respond to our question, what's the crack? And he said, all good. And then he said, actually, no, that's bullshit. Let's start again. and that is Frank's level of commitment to trying to be more honest and tell him, hey, it's never all good. And he's right, it's never all good. But I thought listeners would enjoy that. Frank, if you want, we can edit that out. But
no, that's the reality, and I'm learning more and more that be who you are, be authentic, bring the downsides as well, bring the upsides, and to give space for other people to do that too.
It's beautiful, Frank. It reminded me of a few weeks ago. I had a conversation with someone that I really, really trust, and I was talking about someone that I deeply care about. And I was talking about how they were having difficulties and they were quite sad. And maybe a bit like Seb mentioned earlier, I was thinking of how could I potentially, mitigate this sadness. And then the person told me, sometimes, James, we're sad, Sometimes we're sad. It's the terms and conditions of being a human. And yeah, thanks for reminding me that, because we're gonna have sad days. It's a very sad, sometimes it feels like a very sad existence. And I think we owe it to ourselves to feel that. I think it's amazing that you speak how you cry a lot. A lot of us, a lot of men in particular, we become a bit numb. A lot of men can't remember the last time they cried. And why is that? It's not because they haven't felt, been sad, is it? Or has it they've just numbed themselves from the sadness. And I guess that's for another avenue, for another day. But I do want to really, really thank you for this level of open and honesty that you're bringing to this, particularly because of the difficulty you've had. And I'm very confident that somebody listening will take something from this. And I really hope we're definitely going to dedicate this podcast to your brother and to your sister and to your nephew. And I have a very good feeling that this will help a lot of people in a myriad of ways. So I do want to thank you.
Is there anything we've missed? That I would hate to think that we've bid you farewell without maybe giving you the opportunity to get something off your chest, or to maybe share some information that maybe some people might find useful, or maybe we haven't asked them certain questions that you wanted to give us insightful answers for. So is there anything we've missed that you'd want to tell us before we end up?
Yeah, you asked how do you take care of your own mental health? Would be a good one to ask me, I think. Yep.
Yeah.
If you ask me that one, yeah.
Yeah. So what is it? What are the tricks? What are the Frank Mullane tricks that we can take home for us?
Well, first of all, how do I look after my own mental health? Well, first of all, I was completely ignorant of how to do that. Okay, I never had a clue. I just kept walking forward and didn't know. So before I gave up drinking, I thought drinking was helping me instead of destroying me, until I realized, until other people realized it wasn't. I had some kind of intuition. I have a loving family. I cry. I like to cry. And sometimes when I can't induce it, I put on a video of injustice, like when Susan Boyle was on Britain's Got Talent and the audience rubbished her because she didn't look, like the traditional models, and then she opened her mouth and they loved her. And I thought, oh, how false is that? They're only loving her because she's got a lovely voice. So that makes me cry. And, things like that when you see that. So sometimes I'll put that video on to induce a few tears, because a few tears is a good thing. I've got a very supportive family. My younger sister and my late brother were both Samaritans, and they always said to me, Frank, you don't have to be suicidal to ring the Samaritans. You just need to chat. I get lonely. I get out of perspective on things. I have clinical supervision, which I love, but I do ring the Samaritans, and have chat to somebody. There are times when I can't sleep, maybe, and I live alone. I'm single, and sometimes I just need to hear a voice and talk things through. And sometimes I roar. I just roar, and that feels good as well, especially if you're on a mountain or something. But sometimes I do it in the house, and maybe the neighbours wonder what's going on. But I live alone, and you just do these things. So do whatever you need to do. Don't deny it to yourself. We're all human, and as one of my great friends says, it's not a straight road, and it's a rocky road, isn't it? And there are plenty of challenges thrown at us, and please seek help, talk about it, and watch out for other people.
Beautiful.
That's beautiful, Frank. I think we racked up some new additions. I mean, we've had a lot of guests on. We've had a huge amount of various feedback, ways in which people look after their health. But it's lovely to hear that you have your own unique set of actions that you can do to make you feel a bit better. And again, I just want to harp home about this because, listen, like, you're older than me and Seb, I don't want to ask how old you are. It's not important. But the fact that you're doing this, I can say that the amount of people I know over 50, the amount of men I know over 50 that are speaking about mental health like you are, I could count on one hand. And that's not criticizing anybody. It's fantastic that you're doing this. And I know that this could give the courage to many other men and many other women and many other people. The fact that you're doing this is huge. Also, Frank, before we let you go, I wanted to talk just a bit more about the work that you're doing in AAFDA. And of course, on the Earthly Delights podcast, we judge people by the size of their hearts and nothing else. However, you have been awarded a pretty special prize, and I think we should note that also. But it would be fantastic to hear about the progress that your organization has made, how many families and how many people you're touching, and can someone ring now, someone based in the UK, or can someone in Ireland even check out your website? Is some of the information beneficial for them? We'd love to hear a bit about this.
Yes. So the website is that www.thing, and then AAFDA, which is Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, so AAFDA.org.uk. That will take you to the website, and people can contact a number or an email address on there if they need help, and there's resources on there to help people as well. We're helping hundreds of families in both homicide and have over the years. There's 17 of us now, I think, in AAFDA. So there's a team of advocates, and we have other operations manager, training, business development and stuff, because we also provide a lot of training. We provide the national accredited training to chair domestic homicide reviews, for example, and some other forms of training. And I'm very lucky because I get lots of opportunities to speak, sometimes in Europe, sometimes in America, not that often because COVID knocked it on the head. But you were talking earlier about catharsis. There is catharsis, and I remember something else right at the beginning when I started, even before I started AAFDA, other charities took hold of me, and I spoke at events for them, but they literally, or not literally, but they bathed me in compassion. You know, I felt really well looked after. They put me up in a hotel, loads of pats on the back, you know, they thanked me, and I just felt loved by them. And it was an amazingly warm feeling. And I remember having this idea that if I can get hold of some money, I just want to start another charity where with families that have murder, I'm just going to, if they want to go on a speaking circuit, I'm going to put them up in nice hotels every time for a few nights. Just comfort and care, you know, love, comfort and care. Sometimes you just need that rather than the justice side. You also need the care side.
Beautiful. It's powerful for sure.
We also take families away for 3 or 4 nights to a nice place. It has to be nice food. One of our advocates is a chef as well, so it's good food. And we have events and just chit chats, and there's a long communal table which 24 can sit at. We have a sense of community, swapping stories. We've had an international musician join us, our ambassador, you can see on the website, and play music for us. It's all about community and healing, building bonds and networks after the destruction of murder. I mean, murder is so destructive and it takes so much away, and it steals futures from people, and we have to try and replace those futures with something that's bearable and livable, and you know, still have good lives.
Definitely, really appreciate all your time, Frank. And listen, we'll put all of the links in all the in the show notes. So for anyone who maybe has some more questions that maybe we didn't ask, or want some more answers, you'll find everything that Frank's up to and all of his great work will be in the show notes. So make sure to look there and pass the pod on if you think that this may be of help to anyone who's maybe currently suffering of domestic abuse or anything of that ilk. I just want to just really take the time just to thank you for coming on, Frank. It's it's been a special podcast, and I really, really appreciate your time and your honesty in telling us what you went through and what your family's been through. It's nothing short of traumatic, but we appreciate your honesty on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure to have you on.
I want to thank you both for the opportunity and for standing up against domestic abuse and for doing something around mental health. And I'm chuffed you guys are doing this, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to be part of it. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. And please please keep our email exchange going.
Oh yes, definitely, please.
Hi guys, thank you for listening to the podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a 5-star review if you haven't already. Every review helps us climb the podcast charts so that even more of you can listen to our amazing guests. We really appreciate the support. Remember to tune in next week, but until then, keep safe and have a good one.